Hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you on Wednesday, August 23rd. And you can see my excitement about today's video, which is about one of my favorite financial topics, the debt ceiling. Which, if you aren't familiar, basically Congress came up with this idea that said we're going to have a debt ceiling. So basically, U.S. government can go X amount into debt, which is kind of like a credit card limit. So basically, you can keep spending, and borrowing till at some point you reach the limit, and the whole intended purpose to have some sort of restraint on just spending inevitably, which in concept is a great idea. The only problem is that every time they reach the debt ceiling, they just raise it and ignore it. Fascinatingly, and I get to use one of my favorite words today, demagoguing that goes on behind this is that usually you hear Congress on both sides saying it would be irresponsible not to raise the debt limit because then that would be putting the government in the position of defaulting, which, again, is certainly a political whopper, just the idea that keep spending recklessly and it's irresponsible to actually stop spending, I guess is the way they see it. Now, keep in mind, just because you don't raise the debt ceiling doesn't mean that the government's going to default, because you could reach the debt ceiling and just say, all right, we're going to balance the budget and only spend what we collect in taxes. So I find that to be another one of those political whoppers that's twisted to manipulate public perception and opinions. And again, really kind of stiff-arm people into saying, hey, if you don't go along and keep lodging us deeper into debt like we've done for decades and now centuries, that's the unpatriotic thing to do. Again, I used to get pretty worked up over these things. Now, maybe those years of meditation finally paying off, where certainly if you look at it on the face of it, it's insane, yet that's how it goes. So perhaps what I, on a good day, am able to do is think about, here's what is, how can I plan, make the best, at least with the things that are under my control, and plan accordingly so that whether the U.S. raises the debt ceiling or not, which I'm guessing they will, but still that when you understand what these guys are going to do, which usually isn't too tricky to figure out if you just stop believing them and taking them at their word, you can prepare accordingly. Again, reason 8,462,314 why, to me, the idea of investing in silver, precious metals, or any sort of inflationary, any sort of asset that does well in inflationary times or when governments are getting themselves into deeper trouble, to me seems like a great idea. Again, the manipulation in the precious metals markets has meant that we've had to wait a little bit longer to see the move there. Although it would be interesting to see how the cryptos react should this year's debt ceiling become a significant event, which for many years it hasn't been. You'd really have to go back to 2011 when the Tea Party was a bit more prominent and was really at least putting one element into the whole situation of some sort of restraint. I know some people like the Tea Party, some don't. That's fine. Although just from the standpoint that someone was saying, stop, no, you can't. It's irresponsible to keep raising the debt ceiling and spending more and lodging further into debt that really is never going to be repaid. Speaking of which, just a quick side note. I was listening to an interview last night, or a guest on Max Kaiser's show mentioned that China, the degree to which they depend on Americans to the U.S. to keep buying their products and be their biggest customer, and their dependence on the U.S. Treasury market continues to decrease. So, in terms of the debt ceiling, just you see these forces coming together where people are the creditors to the U.S. are noticing what's going on. It's not rocket science. And it will be interesting to see if this year's debt ceiling does become an issue back like it did in 2011. Now, if you're following back then, remember that's when gold and silver were basically reaching or making new all-time highs. And I don't want to say argue, I would speculate or hypothesize, or I feel almost that perhaps 2011 we were close to seeing this whole Wall Street US dollar game end, and had it not been for the manipulation of the precious metals and several other markets in addition to that, perhaps things would have gotten out of control back then. In the end, they ended up raising it after a very divisive battle that was somewhat of a spectacle. And everyone, for the most part, on Wall Street has seemed to have forgotten about it by then. And why worry when you can just print and borrow more? But I've heard a lot of people talking about this year's debt ceiling, which I guess we're going to reach that limit, the actual real limit. There's always when you reach the limit and then the government commits accounting fraud to delay that a little bit longer until there's actually the break point. And it was interesting because yesterday I was reading, every once in a while I go over to CNBC just for some entertainment, see what the established world is looking at. And basically President Trump said, in regards to his Great Wall of Mexico, if we have to close down the government, we're building that wall. So later on in this article, if Congress does not reach a funding deal that the president signs into law by September 30th, the government will shut down. Shockingly, it appears, it says here, Trump had pledged that Mexico would fund the project, but America's southern neighbor quickly quashed the idea. Hard to imagine the Mexicans weren't saying, yes, we want to give part of what we've earned to fund this somewhat silly idea. So, but when you think about it, I get the feeling that both Republicans and Democrats would all love to get Trump impeached or get him out of there somehow. Certainly, there's a lot of anger and frustration going around. And given Trump's personality, certainly I think you would have to price in some degree of possibility that you could see a spectacle that could really impact the markets. Now, that doesn't mean it's definitely going to happen, but for example, when I used to trade equity options, which options are essentially a bet on volatility. Yes, they can be used for a directional move, but without getting too bogged down in the details, options are basically measuring volatility. So you have events that you price in that, for example, an earnings date would be an event. And you may not know which way things are going to go. Maybe they react or not. But if you have a lot of big events that could impact the price, it raises the probability. Trading being a science of probabilities, we don't know exactly what can happen or what will happen. But you combine all these probabilities, and certainly I would say this debt ceiling becoming more of an issue this year, the probability of that seems to be growing by the day. And given all of these, and anyone else hear Nibbles in the background? Nibbles, come here and say hello for the camera. Here's the dog that keeps the whole show running. There's Nibbles. That's right. Right next to our Fender DeVille amplifier. Maybe Nibbles will run for president and, couldn't probably do a better job than a lot of the guys that we've had in there. Again, just when you think about all these things we hear about going on behind the scenes, the cabinet members that are going in and out. I mean, you don't have to look behind the scenes. You can see how much animosity there is towards Trump. And of course, the Trump supporters are, I would say, pretty loyal and gung-ho about him. And can this debt ceiling be used as a political referendum to push one side's agenda further or not? I don't think that anyone's going to not raise the debt ceiling because they really have decided that they're concerned about fiscal restraint. But for political purposes, could be an event. In a most extreme scenario, this could be perhaps the spark that pops some of the bubbles that we've been watching. Could be the spark that raises or lifts the suppression off of the precious metals. It's not to say definitely that it will, but is there some probability that you would want to factor in and be watching for? I'd say yes. Again, you're going to hear some political whoppers between now and then, which should be entertaining, although what I hope you can get out of these videos is really understanding how to read through what's political jargon and what's market manipulation and what's real and what we can extrapolate and expect. And again, why if you're sitting there invested in the stock or bond markets, by all means, I can't tell you necessarily not to do that. But certainly when these are at all-time highs and you have so many things, again, what was it, yesterday we were talking about the sanctions against Russia and China, whether they're going to go to war against North Korea. And actually something that the American media has not been mentioning too much, but there's some escalating tensions between China and India. It's amazing that Wall Street does its best to ignore this, but certainly those forces are building that at some point will lead to a significant market repricing in a variety of asset classes. And we'll watch out to see what happens in September. It should be fascinating. It really would be amazing if what changed the U.S. empire and history of the world as we know it was Trump refusing to agree with Congress because he wanted to build a divisive wall of Mexico. It's it's amazing. It's amazingly silly almost, yet it's like imagine someone who has a gambling problem keeps getting themselves more and more into debt. Eventually, it doesn't take much. It could be something small that really triggers a crisis. So similar situation to that, something to watch out for, and we'll see how it goes. But in either case, hit the subscribe button. We'll keep you posted and covered on the developments as they happen. And with that said, I do hope you're having a great day and look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Thanks.